Tragedy unfolding in the Central African nation of Rwanda keeps getting worse.
Accused of crimes against humanity,
Khmer Rouge leaders killed around 2 million people. He said everything he did was for the good of the country.
The Serbs had slaughtered thousands of Bosnian men and buried them in mass graves.
The dead in Rwanda in just the last 3 weeks range from 100,000 to 500,000.
It is a crime that has bedeviled world leaders, one that Winston Churchill once called a crime without a name. A crime without a name is both unfathomable and one that is allowed to occur with impunity. Horrified by the events unfolding around him, Lemkin took a stand in defense of the victims to demagogues intent on destroying, eliminating, murdering, and annihilating both the victims and their culture. Lemkin's work resulted in the term genocide and the adoption of the Geneva Convention Code. Raphael Lemkin was born in eastern Poland on June 24, 1900 to a Jewish family. His early education in the humanities led him to embrace the cultures he studied. As a child who cherished human life and its limitless ambition, Lemkin committed himself to researching the history of mass violence, specifically when it was employed systematically against entire groups based on their identity. He read Henryk Sienkiewicz's novel, Quo Vadis, which describes the persecution of Christians under the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero in AD 64. Rendered speechless by such hatred, Lemkin struggled to give language to what he had learned, but could only muster the phrase, acts of barbarity and vandalism in his journals. Though he had not yet found a suitable word to accurately describe the acts, his background laid the groundwork for his later fight for an international law against these acts. As a law student in Germany, he was intensely curious of humanity's history of using language to label violence. Sadly, this curiosity was given a purpose with the constantly emerging news of mass violence around the world, especially in the Ottoman Empire, and it reminded Lemkin of Quo Vadis. In 1921, an Armenian named Soghomon Tehlirian assassinated Talat Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, who was convicted of murder in absentia, to avenge the murders of his family in what was then called the extermination of the Armenians. This phrase did not adequately capture the extent of the destruction inflicted upon the Armenians. Raphael Lemkin could not comprehend how both the perpetrator of mass murder and the assassin of this perpetrator could be tried for the same crime. Deeply affected by these events, he asked, why is the killing of a million a lesser crime than the killing of a single individual? As seen in Pasha's assassination, the absence of a suitable word meant that the extermination of a race, religion, or ethnicity seems comparable to murder. Because the extermination of the Armenians was not distilled into a single word, these inhumane acts remained ineffable to the world. After the Tehlirian trial in 1921, Lemkin wrote that his worries about the murder of the innocent became more meaningful, and that he deplored the absence of any law for the invocation of moral standards in relation to the destruction of national, racial, and religious groups. Determined to change this unfortunate truth, he found an opportunity to propel his solution into universal application at the League of Nations Conference of 1933. He proposed outlawing the destruction of ethnic, national, and religious groups internationally in 2 ways. First, the act of barbarity, which he defined as the destruction of a national or religious group, and second, the act of vandalism, which he defined as the destruction of a culture. Lemkin feared Nazi aggression and believed that his proposal would help protect the European minorities from clearly forthcoming devastation. Unfortunately, because the Polish government was appeasing the Nazi government out of fear of invasion, the Polish Minister of Justice, Joseph Beck, opposed Lemkin's presence at the conference, claiming that his proposal was the work of a selfish diplomat seeking only the protection of his race from a baseless threat. However, Lemkin would not be silenced because he knew that these crimes were repeated with what he described as biological regularity. The conference discussed his proposal, but it received little support. Lemkin cited many cases of barbarity and vandalism throughout history, but one delegate responded that these frequent occurrences were too seldom to legislate. Delegates at the conference wondered how the crimes of the distant and savage past were of any concern to the civilized and modern continent. Opposition was so intense that when the discussion of Lemkin's ideas began, the president of the Supreme Court of Germany and the president of Berlin University angrily left the conference. Beck's fear was confirmed, and he criticized Lemkin for insulting our German friends. After the Nazis bombed Lemkin's home, he journeyed throughout Europe for 18 months until he found refuge in the United States, where he taught international law at Duke University. At the same time, his mind was set on persuading the US to join the Allies and save Europe from the horror that they would soon face from the Nazis. In 1944, Lemkin began working in the US Department of War as an international law expert. Although by this time most European and American policymakers had heard of the camps where millions of Europe's Jews had been murdered, these stories were, to Lemkin's dismay, not of concern to the American government, which was preoccupied with thoughts of war. All over Europe, Lemkin wrote, the Nazis were writing the Book of Death with the blood of my brethren. In his attempts to protect European minorities, Lemkin frequently wrote letters to anyone he believed could affect positive change, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Lemkin suggested that the U.S. adopt a treaty that banned barbarity and urged the Allied powers to prioritize the protection of minorities. While FDR recognized the dangers to minorities, he claimed that there would be difficulties in adopting such a provision and therefore urged Lemkin to have patience. In response, Lemkin disapprovingly wrote in his journal, "Patience is a good word for when one expects an appointment, a budgetary allocation, or the building of a road." Still struggling to raise awareness for the millions suffering from immense cruelty, he remembered Churchill's euphemism, "a crime without a name." Lemkin realized that the namelessness of the horror contributed to the world's failure to recognize its unique evil. Lemkin, a linguist, maintained that new words are created when a social phenomenon strikes at our consciousness with great force. He created his new word with the goal of directing public attention to its meaning. The word genocide was first used in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
As news of Nazi crimes flooded the press, so did Lemkin's word genocide. During the Nuremberg trials, Lemkin worked to ensure that the crime of genocide was included in the charges filed against Nazi leaders. Lemkin believed that by including genocide in the indictment, the enormity of the Nazi crimes had been more accurately described.
The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. Genocide, the extermination of whole categories of human beings, was a foremost instrument of the Nazi doctrine.
Indeed, the word genocide has changed the way nations across the world respond to these crimes. The member states of the United Nations could no longer turn a blind eye to these horrific acts. Lemkin's research of genocide and his conviction that it must not be repeated led to his tireless lobbying for a UN resolution that would make genocide an international crime.
As a lawyer, I thought crime should not be punished by the victims, but should be punished by international law.
Though Lemkin was struggling with poverty and bouts of illness, his only concern was the adoption of this new law. Finally, on December 11, 1946, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 96 entitled The Crime of Genocide. The resolution defined genocide, invited member states to enact necessary legislation to prevent and punish genocide, and requested that a draft for a genocide convention be submitted at the next session. Consequently, on December 9, 1948, the General Assembly ratified the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Thanks to Lemkin, for the first time in history, an international lawmaking body outlawed the murder of individuals based on their identification with a particular group, viewing genocide not only as an attack on individuals, but also as a destructive attempt to annihilate their ideas, culture, and history. The convention clarified that genocide is in fact an international crime in times of peace and in times of war. At long last, the killing of 1 million people was no longer a lesser crime than the murder of an individual.
The world decided that genocide is a crime under international law, and that a treaty should be signed by member states in order to prevent and punish this crime of crimes.
Despite his success at the UN, Lemkin struggled throughout the 1950s to gain funding for his efforts to research cases of genocide and to inform others about its effects. Undeterred, however, Lemkin worked as a professor of international law at Rutgers University from 1956 to 1957, where he opened young minds to the terror of genocide and encouraged future generations to fight against it. For his work, Raphael Lemkin was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize several times. However, on August 28, 1959, Lemkin, who was prone to excessive exhaustion and nervous breakdowns due to his advocacy, suffered a fatal heart attack in New York City. A man who fought for justice for millions around the world succumbed to a silent death, penniless, hungry, and alone. His struggle to name and criminalize genocides remained important to the international community. By coining a single word, Lemkin made it illegal for a nation to acknowledge genocidal acts while continuing to ignore them. During the Rwandan genocide, the United States government did not acknowledge the genocide and instead called it a civil war. After admitting that the Rwandan conflict was indeed a genocide, the United States could no longer ignore the events.
We did not immediately call these crimes by their rightful name, genocide.
Lemkin's efforts on behalf of those who suffered and perished served as the precursor to the International Criminal Court in 1998, which prosecutes the perpetrators of genocide and other crimes against humanity. Through his creation of a word that described the destruction of an entire population and his struggle to outlaw such acts, Raphael Lemkin gained international recognition for naming a crime that has threatened the world for centuries and left a legacy that continues to protect minority populations today.